Okay. So just some bits of business before we start off. I would ask you to keep any questions till we have our question and answer sessions. There's one midway through and at the end. And if you could use the hands up icon if you're online, that would be more than helpful. For those in the room, I think you know where the restrooms are, so I don't think I'll need to describe that. And if there's a fire alarm in the room today, it's for real. So we should go out that door as quickly as possible. I think we've got most of your emails. We have the journal paper that we've already sent, but we'd also plan to send you the PowerPoint and the recording following the session. So make sure that we have all your emails, and we will do that. And we've got teas and coffees in the room. I'm sorry we can't provide that online. So do feel free to have your own drinks. Gerald, I think you were going to introduce us to an activity first of all.
Yes. Again, thank you for joining us. You know, it's really good to be in the space with those others who are concerned about trauma and the impact of trauma on the lives of individuals from childhood to that follows all the way through adulthood and lifespan. So it's always good to be amongst those who are interested in trauma and working as a part of an organization that sponsors these kind of talks and explorations about trauma and looking at resilience. The other part is, you know, the trauma-informed global resilience, looking at interventions, looking at ways in which we might be able to address some of the trauma concerns. And trauma interventions are not one size fit all. It really is, you have to take into account all of the individual things that make us who we are. And so to begin our exploration of trauma in African-American trauma, as well as in Palestine, I would like to ask you to begin with, let's write down. We're going to explore your own personal identity. And so all those things that make you who you are, all those things, whether it be your belief in God or no belief in God, your family, your worldview, all those things, race, ethnicity, all those things that are integral to who you are. And we want to be able to be reflective upon all those things that make you who you are. Okay, so we're going to take 5 minutes to sort of just look at that particular element and write those things down on paper as much as you can. All those things.
Let's try it here.
Thanks.
Are you hearing us?
I think there is a technical problem because our colleague Hassan, Dr. Hassan, says that he is not hearing us.
It may be. I think the rest of you probably are hearing us. Would that be right? Which would suggest that it may be an issue for Hassan, unfortunately.
Maybe.
I suggest that he resets his computer so he might get it. So there's a problem with the audio.
Well, we could use you here.
Sorry, I think he should reset his computer. Might solve
We
the
hear,
problem.
we hear
Okay.
well here.
Can you raise your hands if you can hear us?
Yep, we're okay.
Okay, we're okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Aman,
So those of you who have had the opportunity to jot down some things about who you are, your personal identity, who might feel comfortable in sharing? Any takers before I become a teacher and start calling on people?
People start.
Okay, that's great.
Okay, so the things that make me William, the first one is my belief in God,
Mm-hmm,
and then the second one being coming from an African descent,
mm-hmm,
where I believe in communal life,
mm-hmm,
and the fact that I believe in humanity,
mm-hmm,
and I always look at it in terms of we are all in this life, in this thing called life together, so we better treat each other well,
mm-hmm.
and then also trying to do the best I can for the things.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else care to share? Our online audience, anyone?
I don't mind. Hello,
Okay.
everyone.
Hi.
I just put down the following words. So I'm a mother, a teacher, a learner, a wife, a traveler, white European, investigator, searcher, daughter, sister, a reader, a music lover, a granddaughter, and German.
Okay. Thank you. All right, well, thank you. I want you to hold on to those for now, where they will come into play later on in our seminar, but hold on to them for now. And I thank you for those who shared and those who were able to write some things down. It's not an easy question, so thank you for going ahead and writing them down. So here we are. Buckle your seats.
Okay, so I'll take you through an introduction of what we're all going to cover today. And I have to say that you prepare yourselves for a shock after once Gerald comes back and takes you through what he's going to do with what you've written down about yourselves. But that'll come later. So what we're going to cover today? Well, we're going to cover the asymmetrical conflicts and how democracies deal with organized minorities. Well, then, and that'll be more general across multiple countries. And then we'll look specifically at the case of African American intentional trauma. And then we'll look at the case of Palestinian intentional trauma, where we have Rassan Abdallah there to take us through that. So thank you, Rassan. We'll look at current treatments and their limitations, particularly set within different cultures. And then we'll look at addressing the missing piece. And Gerald will take us through racial socialization as a mechanism for facilitating approaches to healing. Now, why aren't these traditional Western models working as well as they should within other cultures? And then we'll look at next steps at the end of the session, because we don't want today to be an event in itself, but more part of a process where we can collaborate with each other and take things on together. So let's look at asymmetrical conflicts around the world. There are three main aspects. One is power asymmetry, secondly, strategic asymmetry, and thirdly, structural asymmetry. So with power asymmetry, you're really looking at the quantity and quality of force any country or group have, be it through their military or their police or other mechanisms. And it also includes what international and international backing they have, be it political, financial, or indeed military. So who's got the power in any particular conflict? and who has less power in those conflicts. Secondly, strategic asymmetry, which is closely aligned to power asymmetry, which is really the use of technology and firepower that each opponent has. Now, who's got the AI, the facial recognition, the drones, the missiles, the troops? What's their strategy versus decentralized cells of freedom fighters or insurgents or terrorists, depending on who's doing the labeling and who's got the power to do the labeling? So what's the strategic asymmetry? And that also includes information technologies and networks. In other words, you're looking at the communication structures, be it intelligence services and how they operate, or how other groups might be using the dark web to communicate with each other in unseen ways. So what's the strategy there? And then finally, looking at structural asymmetry, which is really all about the aims to change the structure of the relations between the opponents. In short, who has access and control to the land and to the resources, and who wants to have access and control to that land and resources, and what are they prepared to do to achieve it? So asymmetrical conflicts. And related to asymmetrical conflicts, and particularly where democracies are involved, they tend to behave in certain ways towards organized minorities. Turns out democracies tend to detest organized minorities, where they feel a sense of threat from those minorities and where they want those resources and are willing to go after them in militarized ways. So democracies, rather ironically, enable domination of one group over another. And they do so often in the most barbaric of ways. They inflict military violence in a domestic context. They unlawfully incarcerate large numbers, typically without trial or utilizing military trials behind closed doors. They torture a certain proportion of the incarcerated population. And then they release a proportion of those that are tortured back out into the community. Perhaps the most corrosive of all. So the community never know who the spies are. So they're intentionally fracturing both at a familial level and at a community level, where you're never sure who you can trust. And of course, these actions within democracies are typically at covert or semi-covert levels, to enable plausibility and political deniability. So there's usually multiple discourses, many of the antithesis of what's actually occurring. So continuing that with regards to democracies and dominant nations, what's their way of dealing with other ethnic groups, particularly when they're within a state? And we've referred to that within our own research as mechanisms of intentional trauma. Well, this is what they do. They exterminate. They have mass killings. They engage in genocide. They have summary executions, and they have no trials. They put others into servitude, so the other is the subject of their will, be it slavery or violent military occupation or some other mechanism. They outlaw people in communities. They make them illegal. They don't give them citizenship, and they deprive them of all those legal protections. The land is occupied, and they take control over culture, economic practices, and movement. They introduce segregation and barriers. They establish apartheid. Dominant nations dealing with ethnic groups within a state, and then reduce that population to a state of dependence. Wealth displacement, so if they have money, they will come and take it forcibly. They create lack of job security, they create unemployment, and they limit the very basics of life, be it food, water, and electricity. Oh, this is written in 1834, between 1834 and 1902, by the way. So it doesn't look like much has changed. So what are the acts of intentional trauma? Excuse me, So what are the acts of intentional trauma that lead to dehumanizing of people and seek to actively instill terror in both children and adults. And within our own research, we've defined that as the intentional trauma as a type of trauma that results from purposeful, implicit, and explicit acts of violence and oppression from others. So what are those acts? Slavery, forced labor, domestic servitude, turning human beings into a commodity, something less than human. It involves structural racism that's enshrined in law, and also the unwritten laws, seeing the other as immoral and animalistic. They fragment and incarcerate the society, whether it's in walled enclaves, plantations, or districts that are filled with poverty and are criminalized. Michael, could I ask you can you accept anyone into the room? I'm not sure you can. Okay. So I'm just waiting for two to come into the room. They ration the basics for life, be it water, electricity, and indeed homes and houses through house dispossession and destruction. There's typically systematic rape, sexual abuse, and sexual trafficking. People disappear, and there's either no information or limited information provided. There are abductions, and then the bodies are discovered when they're killed. There's unlawful detention and inhuman prison conditions when they are detained. Covert use of routine and severe torture. Mass killings in graves, murders, and lynchings. Ill treatment, be it from police, military, settlers, whoever is in the group of power engaging in a colonial endeavor. And persecution for arbitrary reasons, on personal whim of either soldier or police. It doesn't matter what you're doing, it will be made up, leading to a profound lack of safety and protection. These are the acts of intentional trauma to dehumanize and instill terror. So I'm just going to have to stop sharing to get a couple of people in from in the waiting room. So excuse me a moment. There we go. Thanks for your patience.
More.
Okay. Oh, Karen, just now. It's okay.
That is more about you set me as.
Okay. So we're looking at covert use of torture, mass killings, ill treatment. Yeah. Moving on. So those are the acts of intentional trauma. What's the normal response to extreme human rights abuses? Because intentional trauma is an extreme human rights abuse. Well, if you look at Van der Kolk, he would frame child trauma within the context of developmental trauma. He originally did that from domestic violence over an extended period of time, but it's also appropriate to utilize developmental trauma within a war and occupation and slavery context. So first of all, as part of developmental trauma, there's post-traumatic stress disorder. That response to triggers, and those triggers are sensory fragments of the original event or events and experiences. So, for example, a young girl who was badly beaten in the center of a small village. She was triggered by any shouting. Why was that? Because at the time they were shouting, "Kill her, kill her." She was triggered by any smell of aftershave because she smelt the aftershave at the time of those who were beating her. She experiences her stomach turning over, and that becomes a trigger because her stomach turned over at the time when she was being assaulted. So you have these sensory fragments that occurred in the original event that are re-experienced. Now, she remembers their faces. She remembers the angry and hateful looks on their faces. But when she's flashed flashback again, all those visual, auditory, embodied experiences occur again. And it's not a memory, it's an experience, it's re-experiencing. It's the past coming into the present. So PTSD is very much part of developmental trauma with the flashbacks, the hyperarousal, and the avoidance of behaviors. They're trying to avoid those triggers. And because it's sensory fragments, there tends to be a lot of triggers. So often children and adults' lives get smaller and smaller as they try and avoid those small fragments of triggers that place them back into the past again and again. They also tend to experience a multiplicity of losses, which leads to a response that's more akin to PTSD, referred to as complicated grief. So if you have children who have multiple losses of schooling, of relatives, of friends, of pets, of home, then the response is less likely to be a grieving response and more likely to be a response that looks like PTSD with triggers and flashbacks and hyperarousal and avoidance behavior. So what else is developmental trauma than PTSD? Well, typically you get a sense of hopelessness and a foreshortened sense of the future. So I've worked with children who will literally tell me they won't get past 18. They'll be dead before then. They feel so hopeless and believe they're not going to live. There's a kind of existential shift where the world is a bad place. Well, the world may well be a bad place in these contexts, but this is when it gets hot-wired into trauma. So they might end up in a good place, somewhere that is safe, but still hold that the world is a bad place. And they may take on the feelings of shame and humiliation that are really the perpetrator's feelings, that should be the perpetrator's feelings of shame and humiliation. But the victim, the survivor, picks those up and feels them. So an existential shift. The heart gets switched off. So these kids struggle to care for themselves. And with the heart switched off, they may also have trouble to care for others. They may also harm themselves and harm others. The self-harm may be about at least beginning to feel something because they're in a dissociative state. So at least cutting yourself and feeling it, at least that's something, rather than the madness of dissociation, because that's what it feels like. Dissociation feels like you're going mad. And of course, within Gaza at the moment, if I go more specific, what we're hearing, of course, is the extent of children who are frozen, that frozen watchfulness, that dissociative experience of switching off, of derealization, where the world around doesn't feel real anymore, doesn't feel solid, as if you're going to fall through the ground. Or depersonalization, where you no longer feel within your body. You're outside yourself looking at what you're doing rather than being a solid person within oneself. Or some may be experiencing dissociative amnesia. They forget, they don't remember. The memory has blocked out some of the horrors that they've witnessed and seen and experienced. And for others, again, tends to be over extended periods of time of overwhelming horrors, they may have identity disorder. In words, their personalities get fractured into parts. So often there's a small child part that's like a small voice, a small youngster. Or there's a parentified part, which is there to protect the child. So it becomes a parent-like voice that's more critical. And there's usually a part that's in terror and frightened and fearful. And sometimes there can be abuser and perpetrator parts. So these fragmented parts that literally switch from one state to the next. They're discontinuous. Some children and adults are aware of those parts. Some aren't, and they still switch from one to another. And then you get embodied symptoms of illness from developmental trauma and those enduring trauma experiences. And those become severe, like heart attacks and cancer. But lots of body pains and physical illnesses are part of the trauma response over time. Self-harm, I mentioned earlier, but also suicidal ideation, a belief that they can't go on, and perhaps not surprising given the looping of the PTSD response. Or the levels of dissociation that some will switch multiple times in a day into a dissociative state. substance use for others to self-medicate and dull that emotional pain. And again, because of the heart switched off, some will re-victimize themselves. They'll put themselves back into victim situations, or they'll do the other, which is they'll place others in the role of victim. Either way, they're replaying the trauma in this trauma loop. Normal responses to extreme human rights abuses. And of course, it goes beyond when conflict is around over an enduring period of time, multiple generations. Then you get intergenerational trauma, where the caregivers are traumatized. So they're quick to anger and rage on the one hand, or they're switched off and emotionally unengaged in the other. So as a child, you're either terrified because you've got this raging parent, or you've got a parent who's not responding to you at all. So life's unpredictable within the home setting. And that ruptures the attachments, those secure attachments that are so central for growth and development. And it fractures the protective shield of childhood. These parents aren't in an emotional condition to protect their children. Of course, within many of these contexts, they're not in a physical situation to protect their children as their houses get invaded by others. And these children, again, if the harm is there long enough, become bottom-up rather than top-down processors. In other words, they look out to the world in a very different way from others. So your top-down processors, your children with good well-being, they're looking from their neocortex. They're looking at the world, they're thinking about the world, their emotional brain, their mammalian brain is switched on, so they're feeling things are okay and they're making sense of their emotions. And only when under threat would their reptilian brain be triggered. Your bottom-up processors, on the other hand, are the opposite of that. They're looking at the world from their reptilian brains. They're looking around rooms, they're looking around towns, they're looking around streets, and they're looking at where's the danger coming next. Where's the threat? Who's the dangerous person in this room? That's where their focus and attention is, rather than on what they might have to learn in school, for example. So bottom-up processors of all sorts of learning difficulties. And these kind of intergenerational trauma, the bottom-up processors, the dissociation, typically leads to chronic community violence. Because those hearts are switched off. Resentment and aggressive relationships. There's often increased levels of domestic violence that go along with war or occupation or in servitude. And there's often higher levels of sexual violence as well, often unseen, but it's there. And many children will avoid building relationships with others just because there's been so much pain and loss, because they lose a sense of relationships will be enduring. There'll be an end coming. It's a painful way to live. So what's the scale of intentional trauma? Well, I mean, it's vast, I think, when you look at the figures. 11 million African Americans in slavery in the US, and their descendants. Well, their descendants won't be 48 million, but that's how many African Americans are in the US today. So 50 million globally in modern day slavery. So slavery is still live and, well, tragically and horrifically in our world. Increased forced labor, forced marriage, sexual trafficking, the list goes on and on. 2.7 million in the West Bank in fragmented and walled enclaves, experiencing violent military occupation. 2 million in Gaza, experiencing recurring war, and now an escalation of genocide. And 1.8 million Palestinians in Israel experiencing discrimination and the trauma related to what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank. So that's a sense of the nature of the trauma response, the intentional trauma that's inflicted on others, and the scale of this as a problem to be addressed. Going to hand you over to Gerald, who's going to take that stuff and make it more specific in relation to African-American trauma.
Thank you. We're going to this slide for the moment. We will come back to this slide. I wanted to also let you know, some of this stuff is very triggering. It's very triggering. And what we have to understand is, and take that feeling of trigger, that sort of that hypervigilance that comes from being triggered, and just sort of put it within the context of the individuals that were experiencing that. We want to be able to say that it is not, we went over numbers, we went over statistics, we went over those kind of things, but it really is at the individual level that this is affected. It is at the individual level. We talk about trends, we talk about those kinds of things, but it's a real phenomenon. It's a real phenomenon that limits people's lives, their ability to be who they are, the ability to even project themselves in the future. So you're stealing a past, and they see themselves in the here and now eternally. So I want to look at the case of African Americans. If you could mute yourself, if you're not speaking, that'd be great, because we're getting feedback from, I think, online. Thank you. So I'm very proudly African American, and I'm proudly African American because when they say I am the hopes and dreams of a slave, I am the hopes and dreams of the slave. I am the hopes and dreams of the slave. And I just wanted to really focus in on the original trauma that occurred in terms of African Americans. African Americans, we were, as Baldwin said, we are African without memory, and we're Americans without privilege. So we trace our roots back to the African continent. We trace our roots back to Africa. But in that same context, because of intentional trauma inflicted upon us, and because of structural violence that is endemic in this particular culture, we are limited from our participation. You take a people who were used to being part of the environment, used to being part of a land. That land meant something more than just where they lived. It was generational. It was where they could trace their heritage back. They could trace their birth. They could trace their parents' birth. It was more than just where they lived. There was a connectedness to the land. And then you kidnap these people, suddenly take them out of the environment, and then you decide that they could be packed like this particular slide. They could be packed like this and brought to another existence. So what do you think that felt like? What do you think that felt like? And just a disclaimer, I am African American. I am also the grandson of a minister. We believe in a call and response. So when I ask a question, it's not rhetorical. So when I ask a question, I'm looking for some answers. I'm in my culture. So I like to get the feedback immediately. So just anyone, what do you think that does to an individual who is tied to the land? The land is about heritage. The land is about who they are, gives them part of their identity. And moreover, it's about how you relate to yourself and to your creator, however you term your creator. It's also about how, where your future is, where your children's future will be. But you take them and you put them in a situation like this. What do you think might be some of the feelings experienced at this particular point? Anyone?
I mean, I think a dehumanization for sure, especially, and just like a rip from culture. Right.
It's a rip in culture, and culture for so many is a large part of how we define ourselves, right? So we're talking about that intentional trauma coming in and bam, destroy, trying to destroy it from this point on. There are lots of ways in which they perfected the system. It was perfected, But this particular way, from the very beginning, it's about dehumanization, destabilization, disruption of family ties, all of those kinds of things that we know intentional trauma does to individuals. I pay homage in the beginning of this, Jacob and Charity Foy. Jacob and Charity Foy were slaves. Charity was a slave until she was 12 years old. Jacob was a little bit older when he was, when the Emancipation Proclamation came about. They were illiterate. And it is in that particular context that they managed to grow. They were farmers. They managed to live in that particular context. And I take particular exception to this because these are my great-grandparents once removed. So, next picture. These are my great-grandparents once removed. So it's real. It's real. I am the hopes and dreams of the slave. I am what they always wanted to have. They were illiterate, but by law, they could not be educated. They could not be educated. But they made a vow that their children and their children's children would be educated. I inherit that part of them, but I also inherit their trauma. The trauma of being marginalized, the trauma of being dehumanized within a particular context, in a situation. I inherit the trauma of not being perceived as always being perceived as less than, no matter what situation you walked in. No matter what situation you walked in. I can't tell you how many times that I've experienced that imposter syndrome, where we sort of walk into situations and we feel like we have to prove ourselves over and over and over again and say that, well, I'm not as good as they think, I'm not as good as they say I am, or really feeling like you may not belong where you are. So I inherit that trauma from them as well. My mother was lucky enough to meet them. Charity lived until she was 102. And my mother was lucky enough to meet Charity, not Jacob. Jacob was Native American, Tuscaroran. He was enslaved as well. They were a darker hue. And so he was enslaved as well. But that is why I insist that we look at this on a personal level. We're not looking at it as some number, some extraction, some trend, that the way things trend. We have to look at it on a personal level. What does it do to me as an individual when I have been part of that traumatic system? When I have spent a great deal of time learning to interact within that traumagenic system, learning to interact. That's the important piece. We have to learn to interact within that traumagenic system. Learning how to behave, not look at Caucasians in the eyes, not being able to shrink yourself in any context that you enter because you don't want to be perceived as something that might cost you your life or cost your children lives or make you further lose control over your destiny and your children's destiny, because one of the punishments was often to break up families and sell families away. Disrespect for any kind of familial ties other than what has been sanctioned by the slave owner. So I inherit their trauma. I inherit all those things that the solidogenics as well, but also I come with their trauma.
People have been.
Pardon?
I'm saying people are also like.
Okay. Thank you for the comments that are coming. Keep them coming. As again, I said, I'm part of that call and response culture, so we want to see what you're thinking as you are processing this information. So it's helpful. I also am one that says, you know, we know that it facilitates a particular topic to say, wait till the end to ask your questions. I think it's helpful to process it then and there, deal with it then and there. So if you have a question, if you have a comment you'd like to make, please feel free to raise your hand as well, because we want to hit it right there. We want to hear it right there. Okay. SC plus RGO equals PI. What does that mean? What does that mean? Other than, you know, I like equations. And I can't claim originality in this particular equation. This particular equation, it came about from a theorist who really was looking at Black identity and the idea of becoming Black, negrescence, that process of becoming Black. And what does that actually mean? Bill Cross. And Bill Cross and the theorists like him really looked at, okay, what is it, when we talk about our personal identity, what are those components of that personal identity? And it really, when we say negrescence is just a French word for becoming Black. And it's moving from a Eurocentric perspective to a more African-centered perspective. I was lucky enough to work with Bill Cross years ago when he was here, and be a part of some of the conversations about this. And we're talking about self-concept. Think about that. We're going to define that later. We're going to define it, well, in the very near future. Self-concept plus reference group orientation equals personal identity. So remember this equation. We'll come back to this equation at a particular point, but it is important that we remember that. We talk about self-concept. What is self-concept? You know, there are many ways that it has been defined, but we want to talk about what actually is self-concept. Self-concept is a general term for being aware of oneself and a concept of oneself. It's formed through experiences, interactions, and reflections that is pivotal to influence behavior, emotions, and interpersonal relationships. And what I did not add here that I should add, interpersonal relationships, but also intrapersonal relationships. Pivotal in intrapersonal relationships, not just how you relate to others, not just the ways in which we build relationships with others, but also how do we build relationships with ourselves? What does that mean? What does it mean to not build good relationships with yourself that produces maladaptive behavior? So we want to be able to make sure that we are talking about not just the ways that we relate to others, but the way we relate to ourselves and all of that feeling about self, you know, whether we are strong, whether we are able, whether we can work in a variety of contexts and not be, and have this identity that is stable and it doesn't change. Reference group orientation really relates to the group that we perceive to be most like us. The group that we perceive to be most like us and the reflected appraisals that come from that particular group. Say, we know that, you know, in lifespan theory, we're shifting between where our reference group may be our parents very early on, parents, adults, elders, those people we see to be around us, our caretakers. As we move forward into adolescence, we're building more and more independence. Hopefully, we're looking at our friends, our peers, those we perceive to be, at that particular time, we perceive to be most like us. And then, you know, we are, at some point, hopefully, we have done all of those things, all the calibrations and thinking about who I am in this context, who I am in that context, and being able to pull those things together and come up with an identity. What is my identity when I reach adulthood? And so,
You have a question from Dr. Zia asking, is there a difference between self-concept and self-actualization?
oh, it is. It is. Self-actualization is a point at which you feel like you have righted all the wrongs that you have that might be part of your reflections upon self. That interrelationship, that reflection upon self. So you've righted all that wrongs and you've actually moved to your highest self. Self-concept, you may not be at that point. You may not be at that point. It might be that, you know, you have to do additional work in order to throw back or lessen the bonds of intentional trauma to be able to express yourself, be who you are, be able to be actualized. And so, yes, there's a difference. Any other questions online? I want to look at the ways in which, the many ways, the myriad of ways in which they, the oppressors of African Americans have engaged in what I call soul snatching. Because you'd say your soul is the basic essence of who you are. And so when I talk about soul snatching, I'm talking about being able to come in and supplant all of those ways, your personal identity that you believe that who you are. Being able to subvert that, come in and change it, make it less efficient, all those kinds of things, the ways in which you think you are, being able to snatch it away. In the case of African Americans, brutality was the main mechanism, and so I term it snatching one's soul. Even your relationship with God and who your God is, being snatched away from you, being told that you were mistaken, that your God doesn't exist and my God is better than your God. Those are ways in which the soul was snatched. They engaged in snatching the soul, creating that schism that we talk about, that sort of rupture in self-concept, that fractalization that happens in self-concept with extreme trauma and being poly-victimized. Victimized in not just one way, but being victimized a myriad of ways. So we're talking about that soul snatching, being able to break down an individual. So we look at you know, severe beatings, severe ways in which it's been reinforced that you are less than. So that's snatching your soul, taking that away. All those things, your land, which is important to you. Your land is generational. It's what's been passed down to you. It's your past and it's your future. But now we're in a situation in which you have no past because you cannot connect to your past. What we know is Marcus Norris and Bronner actually look at this as dividing cognitions, your one schema that's your personal identity away from your racial identity. So this chasm that occurs. And so how do we do that? We brutalize in every way that we know how. We tell you that your basic relationships to family don't exist. You're not really a father, you're not really a mother, you can't protect your child, you can't protect your wife, you can't protect your husband, you cannot protect anyone. You can't protect your own body. So we know that it was an extremely brutal system. And I say some of the first consultants hired in the Americas, in the US, were the individuals that they brought here from Barbados to teach landowners and slave owners in the colonies how to break a slave. Paid for people to come who were very good at it. The slavery in Barbados was known to be particularly savage and brutal. So the first consultants came over, sailed over, and wanted to teach them how to be more efficient at soul snatching, being able to separate those people from the individual who they believe themselves to be, and any kind of autonomy being robbed from them. And I wanted to put this slide here to show you that it has not stopped. I wanted you to see what happened to a Black man because he was Black. Because he was Black. And the indifference and inhumanity that allowed him to be, for agent of the state to put his knee on his neck to the point that he died. And I really wish I could say that this was an isolated incident. I really wish I could say that. But we know that it happens time and time again. Before there was George Floyd, there was Yusuf Hawkins, there was Eric Gardner. Before there was George Floyd, there were men and women lynched in the South to make sure that social conscription was adhered to. Before there was George Floyd, there was, you know, men and women who died beaten to death and starved to death. But what happens is that what Ian talked about is the state now becoming that individual, the state being able now to put their knee on your neck until you die, literally and figuratively, to put your knee. And the ways in which we construct institutional violence by passing laws and passing codes that limit access and grant privilege. You know, I wish I could say things are getting better, but in this particular climate and this authoritarian kind of movement around the world, what we're seeing is that there are individuals who want to turn the clock back. They want to turn it back to the 1930s in this particular country when women were not recognized and African Americans didn't have the vote. And this whole discussion around who's legitimate goes back to the Dred Scott decision that said that people of African heritage in the United States were not considered citizens. So whatever happened to them, it happens to them. It happens to them. But we can do nothing to alleviate it because they were not originally thought about in the writing of the Constitution and our foundational documents. What we know is that the outcome of these kinds of behavior, the institutional violence, the direct one-on-one violence that we talked about it previously, really talking about the formation of PTSD. The formation of PTSD, and even more complex PTSD. So we know that, you know, when we have PTSD, that we have, Ian talked about the re-experiencing of the original trauma, the hypervigilance that occurs, the avoidance of trauma and avoidance of those situations that remind you of the trauma. Maybe a smell, it might be the tone of someone's voice, all those kind of things like that. And we move on now to interpersonal, we move on to complex PTSD. And what we notice is that complex PTSD has all the features of PTSD, but it has these other things on top of it, just as if PTSD is not enough. But when you've experienced trauma for years, for generations, when you live in a traumagenic system, you end up with all these other negative outcomes. You have affect dysregulation, emotional dysregulation. You have those kind of things. You have a negative self-concept. And you have interpersonal disturbances, the ways that we build relationships with others and the way in which we expect, that we expect others will treat us in relationships. And so you have this whole heightened level, this other level of ways in which you are dysregulated. Really looking at the ways in which we relate to intra-self, really looking at the ways in which we relate to those things that are positively us, and the ways in which we relate to the world around us. And when we talk about relating to the world around us, Ian talked in the beginning really about the sort of what we see in African Americans more is a misdiagnosis of things that are trauma related. We see more of we see those kinds of ways in which traditional models don't quite encapsulate what we do. We see individuals who cannot attend to our social cues and clues and understand what is maladaptive and what is a response to trauma. What is a response to trauma? I look at the case of ADHD in African American boys. And we know that, from research that's been done, 60% of African American boys who have been diagnosed as ADHD would better have a diagnosis of trauma, having experienced some kind of trauma. That has real life effect. When we're misdiagnosing people because we can't read social cues and clues. We see more of the dissociative process that happens. That's when, Ian talked about not being able to relate to the world around us and the ways in which most of us would perceive it. We see much more of that happening with African American boys. And another way in which we see this playing out is, that misdiagnosis of ADHD that's so prevalent really does play out in teacher interactions in schools. It plays out in the kind of trauma interventions that are designed, rather than just really talking about, well, I'm gonna give this person a graphic organizer, those kinds of things. Really, we should be talking about neuroplasticity. How can we work within the brain, the context of the brain, to build new networks, being able to make that bridge? How do you teach someone to be organized when organization is not the concept that their cognitions will support at this particular time? So really being able to look at the ways in which these misdiagnoses actually plays out in real life effect. These are real people. These are real children not being able to fully access the curriculum. These are real children who carry a label, because more often than not, they're giving a label like early onset schizophrenia, or ways in which they are being misdiagnosed and not receiving the kind of treatment and interventions that are important for their healing and their being able to move forward. And so we look at some of the factors that contribute to the prevalence of PTSD in the Black community: exposure to racially traumatic events, such as witnessing or experiencing racial violence. What we know too from the literature, there is a whole host of literature that looks at depression in the African American community, and recognize that there's always sort of this low-grade depression based upon having to interact within a racialized society. Based upon that. And that low level increases when we see someone who is perceived to be like us, the victim of intentional trauma. So, when things like George Floyd happened, when George Floyd was murdered by the police officer, that was the talk in our community. That was the talk. And people were talking about how depressed it made them. And I would argue that probably one of the most protected individuals in this, one of the most protected African Americans within this and within our society is Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama, the former First Lady of Barack Obama and of the United States, probably is one of the most protected individuals in the United States, African American individuals in the United States, without question. She has privilege and access to things that most of us would never have. But Michelle Obama talked about how depressed it made her to see these countless things, to see these things occurring over and over and over again. One of the first conversations that African American parents have with their kids, and especially their sons, is not about the birds and the bees, not about, be careful, safe sexual practices. One of the first conversations that's had with you, how do you behave when you're confronted by the police? Because that can end your life. That can end your life. Michelle Obama talked about every time her daughters drive by themselves, how she felt. She was nervous because at the end of the day, they're no longer the first daughters, they're Black women. And being Black women by themselves and confronted by institutional violence, there's no telling what the outcome will be. There's no telling what that outcome would be. So that is something that is always there. It's always percolating underneath the environment. I have that conversation with my son now, who feels like he is invincible and feels like I'm antiquated. Feels like you grew up in the South, that doesn't happen now. What are you talking about? He's 16, and so, and he's experienced a different world than I experienced. And so he feels like those things don't happen. But I tell him, and he's now at the point where he's going to get a driver's license. So my conversation is about how do you behave when you're confronted by authority, when you're confronted by police? Because I want to see you come home. And that might not be the case if you handle it in the wrong way. My mother and father always told me to make sure you're in a well-lit place. If they put the flashes on, drive, I don't care. Drive until you're someplace well-lit, because that danger is always there. So when we talk about living in that traumagenic environment, what does that do to the individual? What does that do to self-concept? What does that destroy? That's sort of an agency that says I should be able to go where I want to go without fear of it costing me my life. Racial stereotypes and expectations, disparities in mental health. Again, we can spend a whole lot of time talking about access to mental health treatment. We can spend a whole lot of time talking about access to mental health treatment. And then talk about when you do have access, will the people there understand what's going on with me? Will they understand what's going on with me? Will they identify this as a response to trauma, some of the things as a response to trauma, or will they just shirk it off as, that's just the way they are. That's just the way they are. And we see that in mental health, we also see it in somatic health as well. We see those kind of discrepancies and those kinds of ways in which you are looked at less than in somatic health as well. I mean, what we know, some of the statistics out there, Black men are 60% more likely to experience an amputation than their white counterparts. And why is that? Why is that? I mean, yes, if you're sick enough to need an amputation, you need to have the amputation. But we're talking about the lead up to the amputation, being ignored when you tell them I'm having pain or I just don't feel right. Those kinds of ways in which you're ignored in the healthcare system follows you to the mental health care system as well. So those kinds of things. When we talk about overrepresentation in the prison population, yes, African-American males and African-American periods are overrepresented within the prison population. We understand that, the US is fifth in size in the world, fifth in size in terms of population, but we're number one in the number of people who are incarcerated. And we say, how does that relate to an African-American phenomenon? How does that relate to this? Because we know that right after slavery is where modern policing began. They were called slave patrols at that time. They were ways in which they had our oppressors had the image that we were going to run amok and do the things to them that was done to us. So there was this heightened sense of we need to protect ourselves. And the Black men, the Black women, they're dangerous. That's sort of beginning of that kind of idea. They're dangerous. And as that, we have to have this really fortified system to control them. So we see the prison system coming about in a swelling, with people being locked up because of they just are at the wrong place and at the wrong time, or they have no money, poverty. So we see those kind of things happening. Disparities in home ownership, wealth, again, systemic racism, as well as institutional violence, educational opportunities. We live now in a country in which there is definitely an anti-Black curriculum. Being able to acknowledge that there are ways in which the curriculum marginalizes your experience, marginalizes who you are. We're living where some are seeking to eliminate the opportunity to hear your history, hear African-American history, to hear the ways in which their ancestors may have benefited from slavery. And they're outlawing it. Now they're outlawing at the high school level. They want to outlaw it. One state, Florida, is working very diligently in dismantling any kind of diversity, any diversity initiative, but also being able to hear the true story, the real story of what occurred. And leading to post-traumatic stress disorder in African Americans and Latino adults are highest in that particular subgroup, those particular subgroups, than any others. African Americans and Latinos have the highest rates of PTSD. Some of the studies that I've read, one particular study was a longitudinal survey and really looked at in 5 major cities, really looking at the population and looking at the African American population and looking at meeting criteria for PTSD. And again, it was postulated somewhere between 55 and 60% met criteria for PTSD. That's a lot of people. And considering that African Americans, make up 13% of the population, and when we talk about African American males, we're talking about 1.5% of the population. And you're saying that many people are meeting criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a heavy story. And it's a story that needs to be told. It's a story that we cannot just look at statistics and say, these are just numbers, and not understand how it impacts us. And being able to understand, we're talking about individuals. We're talking about individuals, individual lives, ways in which we are able to be, fulfill ourselves, reach that idea, that concept of self-actualization, being able to reach that concept. Okay. I told you I was gonna have a problem. Black CTPSD, the existential threat to public health. Again, just going over some of those statistics that we heard before, and being able to really say that what we're talking about is an existential threat to public health. It's a threat to not just the African American community, it's a threat to all of the communities. really looking at dissociation as an important feature that is with African American males, and being able to understand what that dissociation looks like, being able to understand that the ways in which the presentation might be different than the presentation, that we commonly represent as dissociative disorder. One of the important things that I want to pay attention to is the detaching from self, body, or identity. And really being able to say, how does that play out? Well, we want to be able to play it out. It plays out by really looking at the myriad of ways in which that will impact the individual. The emotional numbness that comes a part of it. The emotional numbness, very important. We'll talk a little bit about more emotional numbness. I want to look at this statistic, and these statistics come from 1921. I mean, not 1920, 2021. Well, they could have been, they were probably about the same in 1921 too, just haven't improved. But they come in 2021 when we're looking at the rates in which Black men are dying and the ways in which they're dying. And these numbers are based upon the total number of deaths. Now, again, African Americans, 13% of the population. African American males, 1.5% of the population, 1.5%. But in 2021, when we look at all the deaths of heart disease, all the deaths from heart disease, Black men equal 23.7%. When we talk about all the deaths from cancer, Black men equal 20.2. Unintentional injuries, all of them in the United States, Black men equal 7.9%. Homicide in ages 1 through 44. Again, if we looked at it, banded down just a little bit, looking at moving it up between sort of 16 and 35, you'll see a different number. This will probably jump to number 1. But in 2021, homicides between the ages of 1 and 44, 35.3% of all homicides. Of all homicides. Stroke, 49.9% of all deaths from stroke. Diabetes, 4.3% of all deaths from diabetes. Chronic lower respiratory disease, 3.2% of all diseases, all people who died from that disease in the United States. Kidney disease, 2.6% of all the deaths. Septicemia, 1.8% of all who had died in the US at that particular time. Hypertension, those who died from hypertension. Sort of everybody suffers from hypertension almost these days, but looking at, that's 1.6% of all deaths in the United States associated with hypertension was related to hypertension. How many of these that can we label as being closely tied to stress or has some kind of component with stress? Exacerbated by stress. Any comments online? I can't see it.
Majid is referring to, unfortunately, the enforced disappearance rate is significantly high in Pakistan. Moreover, the incarceration is also very high. Prisons are overcrowded and conditions are pretty bad and upsetting.
Okay.
Thanks, Majid.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, and we've done complex trauma. We've done that in public health issue. Now, at this point,
Should probably take a break.
yeah, it probably is best for us to take a 15-minute break.
Yep. Have a 15-minute break.
Yeah, because I know my voice has worn you down. So we'll take a 15-minute break. I wish you all were here to enjoy the orange juice, the coffee, and the tea, but we're going to enjoy it for you. Okay, so see you in 15 minutes.
Make sure, Gerald, that you take my orange juice.
I have it. I have it.
Okay, great.
It's that joke we always
Here's a
about.
question.
Moses.
Oh, Moses. Oh, Moses, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. I just wanted to respond to your question and say, out of the diseases that I saw mentioned over there, which is a very striking thing, 8 out of those diseases, I would say, are prompted by stress,
Mm-hmm.
be it caused by PTSD or any other things, stresses in life. Actually, they contribute significantly to some of those deaths and diseases that lead to those death statistics. So, stress,
Yeah.
not good at all.
Thank you. And we'll accept this and I'll give you all a little inside information. Moses is a healthcare professional. So we'll take his word.
All right.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See you in 15 minutes. And Rasan, I guess you'll be leading us in the case of Palestine. Thank you.
There it is.
Help yourself to tea.
Yeah.
coffee.
Matter
All
of fact,
sorts.
take a gallon or two.
Yeah.
So I gotta drink a lot of ours.
No, the issue is when we meet very early in the morning because, Islam is in Palestine, so, we're meeting at like 8 o'clock in the morning, the three of us when we meet. And so I always say, who's bringing the orange juice, you know, at 3 o'clock, at 8 o'clock in the morning, it's 4 o'clock in Palestine, and so.
Okay, so I hope you've all had a good break. And I know we have here. Rassan, Gerald made a point of having some orange juice. So I think he looked like he enjoyed it. We're privileged to have Rassan Abdallah here today. I know, Rassan, you've also been very active in inviting your esteemed colleagues to this session. So we're all more than appreciative of you doing so. It's a joy for me to introduce Rassan, a delight of a human being, and a passion and commitment second to none. So over to you, Rassan. Did anyone hear that?
He's muted.
Oh, are you muted, Rassan? I think. Oh, sorry, you're muted, Rassan. We can't hear you because you're muted. Welcome to the club. Technical joy. You're still muted, I'm afraid. Right, can I use my mic? Might be able to unmute him. There we are. Thank you, Rassan. Over to you.
Pleasure. What I said, if you skip this first slide to the end, because it's related coherently my presentation.
Okay, now let me move this. I'll move the slide.
Yeah, please. Yeah, thank you so much, my brother. I promise all of you that it will not be a presentation, a long presentation, no more than synopsis of a presentation. But I'm very happy to say that I'm so proud to say to you all that without the qualitative devotion, loyalty, and seriousness of Professor Ian Barone to humanity, who is not only a friend, but a brother to me, without him and his ongoing follow-up and clear visions, this work, as other achievements in the last 15 years of mutual productive, cooperative, and cooperation would not come to reality. Another important indication of such devotion of Professor Ian is introducing me to a serious, hard-working person, my friend Gerald Novell, with whom we quickly managed to develop a special chemistry because of our so much in common backgrounds, motives to help and support humanity, as well as professional help. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move to number 4. Friends, this is a reality. I don't like to start with realities, but this is a reality that you all agree with, hopefully. Terror and terrible violations are our common enemy, as they have no geographical borders at all. And allow me to give you an example. On the 11th of September 2012, which was the first anniversary of the horrible, terrible of September 11 event, I was invited to present a speech at the United Nations Assembly at New York, Plaza Avenue. The next day, President George Bush, the son, gave his speech about the same issue. I chose this title, Terror Has No Borders, which was published at the New York Times later. You may consult the great Google for that, putting my name and the title. Historically, any conflict or violent confrontations have two stories made by each side to justify his motives towards killing and causing traumatic events to the other. That's why I chose the pronoun his for story, history, not her story, because women have many faults, men have only two, whatever they say and whatever they do. The same it is for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Partners of this conflict keep telling their stories, but rarely they try to promote a third story, a third narrative. Briefly saying, CARE managed to develop after the Israeli incursions to the Palestinian territories in 2001, we managed to develop two initiatives. The first initiative was what we called it refreshing memory. And this refreshing memory has been published in a book in 2005, where we interviewed 10 Palestinians and 10 Israelis, 5 females and 5 males, coming from 10 different geographical areas. None of them was less than 75 years old. We asked them about the social life and the economical life and all these away from politics. And we found that they have so much in common. This was before the 1948 Nakba. You know the term Nakba, what does it mean? So we found so much in common between their lives, and that's why this is the main principle of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. If you look at the term of Palestinian, it means Palestinian Muslim, a Palestinian Jew, a Palestinian Christian. So Palestinian does not mean only Arabs. It includes the three religions: Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And this lasted till 1948, Nakba. The way that it was developed as the following. In 1819, Jabotinsky and the Zionist movement met at Basel, and they agreed to have their Zionist regulations and principles. After the Second World War, the Europeans and the Zionist movement agreed to move the Jews to the promised land, which is Palestine. And here started the problems and the dilemmas and the confrontations. The Jews at that time were no more than 60,000 inhabitants. Now, the British mandate at that time helped the Zionist movement and the Jewish people to replace the Palestinians by immigrants coming from Europe and later on America and the Arab world. And here the violent confrontations started, where the Palestinians were displaced and they were dispossessed. You can go back to a paper which was published by Ian Baron and me under the title of Dispossessing and its Psychological Reflections on Palestinians and People All Over. And this paper was published, I think it was in 2012. Now, followed by the Nakba was followed by the 1967 war, where the Palestinians were again displaced and deported to Jordan. We call them Nazihin, displaced. Now, the second initiative that we started in 2002 was the mental health initiative, where we formed a team. We are very proud of our mental health team, who has been working all over, not all over just for the West Bank, I mean all over West Bank and Gaza. Unfortunately, 5 of our member boards in Gaza, who are professors, full professors, were killed during this ugly, terrible war. And we started working together with the team and Professor Ian Barowan when he was at Dundee University, and till now, for more than 10 years. We have achieved so much. We have so many partners working with us, like the Search for Common Ground, the Columbia University that awarded CARE the prize in 2002, and other international bodies. Now, looking at the ongoing genocide and several wars on Palestinians, one can uncover the hidden goal of such wars is to widen the spread of deep depression, hopelessness, lawlessness, fear, PTSD among not only Palestinians, but other people in the region, which will force people to tend to violence between themselves and others, which create so many emotional disorders and behavior disorders. That's why those wars concentrate on killing children, infants, mothers. As you may know, more than 34,000 were killed in Gaza alone, and 77,000 were injured, demolishing 67% of Palestinian homes, 518 schools, 12 universities. No universities are working in Gaza or still existing. 3 churches and 18 mosques in Gaza only. While the ongoing arresting, killing, injuring, confiscation properties for the sake of building and fattening colonies and limiting the right of freedom of movement for Palestinians in the West Bank. We jointly, CARE and UMass and Dr. Gerald, as well as other research assistants, started this cooperative research more than 3 years ago. Future ambitions. The partners, besides publishing and disseminating this work, are looking for keeping on cooperative relations to combat traumatic events reflections as much as we can for all human beings, not only Palestinians, as we are aiming at abolishing the culture of violence and apartheid to be replaced by a culture of peace through recognizing, humanizing the other's rights, dreams, fears of others as human beings. We as Palestinians expect to start new professional, serious initiatives, fostering already existing ones, targeting adults and youth, both females and males, as well as exchanging experiences through fields and networking. This is because we aim at, now you can show the first, the logos, please. Yeah, this is because we are so keen about the future. This is what CARE is working on. Only through education, both formal and informal education, we can achieve this. And only through apartheid-free zone in the world, we can achieve this also. Thank you so much. As I promised, very, very short presentation. I'm open to discussions, questions, and any needed elaborations.
So can I open up the floor to questions
yes,
for
yes, please.
Rasan?
Hello. Hi, Dr.
Yes, yes.
Hassan.
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Christine. I live and work in Jordan. I have lived in the West Bank for 2 years, many years ago. I've worked there with kids. I've worked with Edward Said Conservatory of Music, and
Yeah, so you were our neighbor.
Yes, I was. I was quite first-hand experiences of the limitation of movement, you know, through logistics and many other things. Now I work in a school in the Waldorf School of Jordan, and I work with a population of students that many of them have Palestinian origins, and I work as a mindfulness teacher, and I often wonder how deeply ingrained is the generational trauma that I sometimes, because I don't have much experience in it, I read a lot in it about it, but I don't know if you've ever done any research on the generational trauma in, particularly in Jordan and in other Palestinian refugee populations around the occupied Palestinian territories.
Allow me to advise you, give your email to Professor Ian Baron. He may pass to you the published paper, Intergenerational Trauma, and we have published it, and you can read it and enjoy it.
Okay, thank you very much.
But working with Edward Said Center, we were living just less than 100 meters away from there.
The old one or the new one?
The old one.
Okay, very nice.
Yeah.
Nice location.
Great.
Yes.
So please, Ian, pass it to her if you can.
I will, and I think, Christine, your sense of utilizing mindfulness is certainly one strategy that has value and some empirical evidence behind it. But I think you're also right to be questioning that may be necessary but not sufficient to enable change for others.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Christine.
Thank you.
Other questions to Rasan just now? Or issues or comments you want to make with regards to Palestine?
There's 2 questions in chat.
Oh, there's 2 questions in chat. Great, thanks, Michael. So Moses, do you want to say your question? What is currently being done for the kids and persons with PTSD history, both by mental health providers and the government?
Yeah. The last study was published by CARE, was the psychological reflections on children from Huwara, Beit Ummar, and Yatta, Masafir Yatta, who were attacked by they call them settlers, I call them colonists, not settlers. And the work took about seven days, where the team stayed there for a week, sleeping with the children in the areas there, interviewing the children, the mothers, and so on, and neighbors. And the children were so terrified. We noticed a lot of symptoms of PTSD among the children and the mothers, even the adults.
Thank you, Rasan.
Pleasure.
And Michael, you're asking a question. What is the situation for children right now in the West Bank, and is the ongoing Gaza war impacting residents?
Recording in
how is the ongoing war in Gaza impacting residents of the West Bank?
I am afraid that people are ignoring mental health issues. And they think that it is only in Gaza. In the West Bank, every day, every night, we do have incursions in one of the geographical areas. In the West Bank, children are exposed to being arrested, injured, or killed. 114 kids were killed in the West Bank, and more than 2,000 children were arrested since the 7th of October 2023. So children in the West Bank are not more lucky than the ones in Gaza. Imagine a child this morning, I heard it from Bashar. Bashar, he is 3 years old. I asked him, why didn't you go to school, to the kindergarten, preschool? He said, how should I go? And my father was killed yesterday in Nablus. His father went to bring them some goods from Nablus, and he was killed by the settlers in Hawara, where the military barriers, you are used to that in 2010.
Thank you, Hassan.
Pleasure.
Any other questions, issues at this point?
Sierra.
Sierra?
Hi there. Thank you for all the hard work that you've all been working on for years. It's incredible across borders, across time zones, languages. I'm based in Canada and I'm a teacher. And in maybe 5 years ago, I remember a situation, I still remember it, where a grade 12 student who was of Palestinian origin was trying to explain to a classmate about the situation. He was trying to just sort of summarize. And he definitely found that there was this total ignorance of the situation of his peers in Canada. And then just last year was teaching, and I remember a girl, she was Palestinian, but via Jordan, and she stayed in over lunch just to finish eating. She wasn't done, and she started speaking just, you know, out of the blue about how her grandfather had been shot by someone, a soldier in the IDF. And that's how the family went to Jordan. And then eventually they moved to Canada. But I find with so much immigration to Canada and the US, which are both states complicit with the violence that's happening, states that are actively promoting the selling of weapons and profiting from it, there's so much ignorance about global politics, about basic geography. If you ask many kids where Gaza is, they wouldn't even be able to point to it on a map, right? So it's, you know, what are these immigrant children supposed to do when they're in school systems where even the teachers have ignorance of the situation, where no one wants to talk about it because it's a tough topic, and where there's a lack of school mental health professionals? And even if there were counselors available, they probably wouldn't have much of an idea of the intergenerational trauma as it is. So these kids would be left with very few helpful resources. And as Dr. Gerald Fonville mentioned, a lot of kids are misdiagnosed with ADHD and all sorts of things. So are you doing work with teachers to help, not to replace the presence of mental health professionals, but what are you doing with teachers to try and help teachers to address these issues?
Yeah, thank you for your question. This makes me go back to the targeting groups that we work with for and by. Part of our groups, targeted groups, are teachers and schools counselors, plus the parents' councils and the head teachers. So we do work with teachers trying to promote nonviolent conflict resolution and to promote dialogue skills, and of course to train the counselors how to cope with or help the kids and the children in schools to cope with the ongoing, not only political violence, but also domestic violence, which is an outcome of the political occupation and the unpleasant political situation.
Time for any other question?
I have one, maybe a comment and also a minor question that kind of follows Sierra's comment and question. So as I said, I work at the Waldorf School here, and I also work with the teachers. I give them, offer them mindfulness sessions 3 days a week in the morning. And I often find that often we skip the mindfulness part and we go straight to like a discussion kind of part. And I definitely can identify generational trauma there better. And they are probably, because they're more mature, of course, they are better equipped in talking about it and talking it through. And they're very grateful for the opportunity to talk through some of the really heavy generational experience of displacement and being a refugee. We have teachers that have inherited refugee status from their parents. But, you know, as Sierra said, what would you advise teachers that don't have this firsthand experience of going through this type of trauma themselves? What do you advise them how they can meet students with these experiences in the classroom? I think about my brother, who is a teacher in Germany, and he has all sorts of backgrounds in his classroom, from Ukrainian refugees, from Palestinian origin Arabs, from Turkish Germans, and you know, it's like it's a whole range of things that he has to kind of juggle. So what would your experience, what would you tell him if he would come to you and ask, how can I approach these very different experiences of violence, of displacement, and, you know, this sort of background?
Yeah, actually, I do have a treasure for you and your brother. I advise you that you contact Professor Jeff Helsing at the United States Institute of Peace at Washington, D.C. He and his department at the USIP, they published a manual for care. It's called Teaching Against Hate. This was in 2005. And you will find that they have it in English. We do have it in Arabic, but they have synopsis of it in English. So you may get it, or if you like, we may translate some of these to you from Arabic to English. Like it's like a manual, training worksheets for teachers like your brother.
Great, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I like to just give my suggestion as well, especially when you're intervening cross-culturally. Always feel free to acknowledge to them that you do not know. Oftentimes what happens is that people walk in with, you know, that we're going to fix everything, and they don't actually know what everything is. So always be able to admit to those that you're working with that you don't know, but you would like to learn.
I totally agree. I'm a very proud sister. My brother is has this approach, and he often sits down with the students in his and uses class time to find out, you know, to go and ask the questions and find out backgrounds. But he came to me and he asked, what can I tell teachers that maybe have difficulties with this, that are not necessarily grew up with an inquisitive mind, right? And so yeah, these are all good pointers to pass along. Thank you.
Please pass to him my contact emails. You may get it from Professor Ian, and he's welcome to contact me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Well, thank you again, Rassan, and all the questions that were asked. I appreciate it. Perhaps in a timely way then, given some of the issues that have been raised with regards to intervention, not just the nature and extent of the difficulties, we're going to look at current psychological treatments and some of the research around those treatments. So the most researched and available treatment for PTSD, complex PTSD for youth is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT is a transdiagnostic therapy. In other words, it addresses a range of mental health symptoms, be it anxiety or depression, behavioral difficulties. Hence, transdiagnostic covers a range of diagnostic categories. Most CBT efficacy studies, however, have European American epistemologies to the admission of minoritized populations. In other words, they're based on a much more individualistic response rather than, Hilda, you mentioned, coming at the very beginning, coming from more of a communal society or context. So they're very much westernized constructs in terms of what trauma is. So when treatments are applied to minoritized populations, as if they're empirically based, because there's good research to back the efficacy of CBT. However, the studies haven't been conducted with, or not many studies have been conducted with minoritized populations. And when they have been, particularly in relation to African American, a small number of studies indicate that CBT is less effective with an African American population. In contrast, the work with Rasan and myself would indicate that trauma-focused CBT delivered by a group has a reasonable efficacy level in Palestine, but clearly there could be enhanced efficacy that we need to look at. There's a number of socio-cultural issues around why is CBT being less effective with marginalized and African American populations. There tends to be an overfocus on these white Western values and a bias towards individualism. There's a lack of recognition of cultural trauma and systemic racism, so the culture in which trauma sits and exists, and there's structural racism that exists. There's an omission of addressing historic and intergenerational trauma with CBT. So it tends to be the here and now rather than that relational and historic influences. And there's a lack of attention paid to the negative impact of racism on youth and their self-identity, self-concept and identity, which, going back to Gerald, is in essence the core of the traumatic experience for many African American youth.
May I just, Ian, briefly, just denominate?
Sure. Sure.
I fully agree with what you have mentioned, but Christine, if you allow me to say, Christine, if I were you, I should ask a question. How did you meet with Ian? We did not meet with Ian in a pub. We met together working in the field since 2010. We have been conducting training of trainers workshops for Palestinian teachers and counselors in different geographical areas. Ian, his first visit to Nablus, when it was in Kerjen, he faced a lot of difficulties. Ian and the representatives of Child and War Foundation in Norway. And we have been cooperating with Ian with different European foundations like Dundee University, and we were cooperating with Glasgow University and with Dundee Friendship Committee with Nablus. And we were cooperating with UMass since years ago. And the last training we conducted with Ian and our friend Uni Hilton from CAO, Child and War Foundation, was on the 5th and 7th of November last year. And we were doing this at the Red Crescent place. And during that training, the whole area was blocked by the Israeli military occupation. And we had a difficulty to go on with the training. So we took a decision by ourselves to delay the training for about 1 hour till the army went out of the area. So we are doing this training of trainers for counselors and teachers. It's not an easy work, but we do have committed, loyal friends and brothers like Ian and Gerald and other trainers, Hilton and Patrick Smith and others who are helping us. So we do need people like you and like your brother to join the club.
Thank you, Rassan. And I think we've always had a lens on not accepting those programs on trust, but embedding the most rigorous forms of evaluation and research to test their efficacy. We've been fortunate that those results have been positive within the West Bank, where PTSD levels have reduced from about 65%, 45% down to about 25% of the child population. So thanks for all your work on that, Rassan, and your team at CARE. Here we're kind of
be thanked is you, not Rassan, because your intensive efforts and ongoing devotion, something amazing for us.
Thank you, Rassan. So I guess some of these issues that I'm raising are relevant because we can enhance the efficacy more, but they're particularly pertinent within an African-American context. So CBT has lacked some participatory forms of engagement. It tends to focus a lot on teaching coping skills rather than participatory approaches. It's tended to lack cultural attunement. So therapists have failed to observe, some of the behaviors or give meaning to some of the behaviors that children and youth are presenting. So they're missing maybe some of the triggers that are set off by microaggressions within daily life. Therapists are not always attuned to the specific language nor cultural specific meanings. So again, Rassan and his team have been foundational in ensuring that any of the westernized programs are set within a cultural context, that the language is Palestinian in terms of the community, the language of the community. The neurobiology research indicates that African-American youth and many minoritized populations can be easily triggered by the markers of white power. And again, that has tended to be a blind spot and a mission in terms of therapists delivering TFCBT. So looking at issues of colonialization, which we've pretty much been covering today, is important if you're doing trauma work. Again, in the US, there's been mistrust of the white US medical system, essentially because of their engagement in cruel experiments with African Americans over some decades. And the result is that with African American youth, they've tended not to attend the CBT sessions, or they've been less engaging during the CBT. And there's also been higher dropout rates. Again, that's been a different picture with CARE in Palestine. And I think that's because CARE have attended to those cultural features and adapted the materials and adapted the nature of delivery.
The kitchen is here.
So what are some of those adaptations that have been required and are required in the US? Well, to provide cultural congruity and embodied safety. So for African Americans and others coming to CBT programs, is there enough attention paid to how calm their bodies are as they participate in these sessions? And do they have a sense that the therapist or whoever's working with them truly understands the historic nature of the trauma and the current harms that still exist that trigger those past traumas? Is there sufficient validation of a youth sense of self and culture, that their own self-concept and the culture in which the reference group that Gerald was referring to, is that included within the nature of the therapeutic experience as part of building rapport and trust? So an African-American youth can think, yes, this guy, this woman, they understand where I'm coming from, what my life is and where it's been as a culture. Can they hear what youth are uniquely saying about their life conditions? Are they asking youth about their general life conditions? And are those who are delivering TF-CBT programs, are they coming with cultural humility? And are they avoiding those non-verbal cues and verbal communication that triggers anxieties and invalidation for marginalized populations? Do they even know what those non-verbal and verbal cues are? What Rasan was referring to earlier is that we've tended to use non-medical therapists, so it gets away from the therapy and it gets away from the medical lens to facilitate youth into programs. And we've tended to deliver in groups rather than individually. And again, that gets away from individualized Western therapy or programs and sets it much more within a group and cultural context. And we've rather than using therapists, and certainly not using Western therapists, it's been insider non-medical led groups. So they've been Palestinian school counselors who have delivered many of the programs. So they're already embedded in part of the culture and have those cultural understandings to be able to change programs as they go. And I think all that, the group-based, the non-medical, the insider Palestinian lens, all has added to enhancing the cultural congruity and probably why we've seen higher levels of achievement. So just current interventions, and again, Rasan helpfully made reference to them. The trauma-focused CBT programs are delivered by trusted insiders, either paraprofessionals, non-mental health professionals, school counselors to deliver the programs, who themselves are experiencing daily racism, discrimination, microaggression, and violence. So they're naturally attuned to the concepts and language of the children, and they avoid that stigma of therapist, medical professional. And of course, utilizing school counselors with CARES network has enabled delivery at scale. It's a broad intervention. It's been group-based, so it avoids individualistic Western conceptions of trauma and healing, and it utilizes the socio-historical and political context in which the children exist. As I think just the final bit was really just affirming the gains that were made in depression, PTSD, complicated grief. However, with there is a limitation to those programs, and Rasan and myself are working on it. Regardless of what area, whether it's in the north, south, east, and west, there tends to be this 25% of children who are still symptomatic following group-based intervention. So I think it looks like there's a need to implement more individualized support for those children who don't respond quite so well to the group-based intervention. So we're looking at how can we deliver those individualized supports. That's not unexpected. That's what happens in Western countries. The groups are initially delivered almost as part of a healing and screening process. And those who don't heal through those groups, then there needs to be that follow-up of individual support. It turns out it's similar within Palestine. And Gerald's going to take us through in a moment the integration of, set within an African American context, racial socialization within trauma-focused CBT. So research suggests that racial socialization and CBT is promising for African American youth. Because racial socialization addresses the beliefs, values, the self-concept issues, social and racial identity and behavioral difficulties, as well as the many daily challenges, stressors, and traumas of systemic racism. So it goes well beyond the coping skills techniques of CBT. Racial socialization can be short and longer term intervention based on empowerment of African American families. So it's not just a family problem is a child problem is a family problem, by improving parent-child interactions and mediating effects of racism on social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes. And racial socialization also focuses on building youth self-esteem and resilience. So a lot of scaffolding around the programs of TSCBT itself. So racial socialization, there's research to say it can be implemented on its own, and it can be implemented with trauma-focused CBT to promote positive parenting, reduce racial stress, leading to reductions in depression, anxiety, and behavioral difficulties. And I'll pass you over to Gerald to kind of explain and talk through what is racial socialization, and how can it be used with trauma-focused CBT?
Right. As my esteemed colleague said, and sort of summing up some of the limitations with sort of traditional CBT, trauma-focused CBT in African Americans, it really does boil down to epistemology, really basic epistemology, the way that we make meaning of the world around us, the way that we see ourselves. And oftentimes when we have constructed that, it's constructed from a European-centered kind of perspective, it alienates those who may not share that same basic epistemology. When I talked about before, we were talking about how the fractured self occurs, really this long-term polyvictimization that occurs, and sort of the fractured self is what happens when we have gone through that process and we have the intention of the intentional trauma is to sort of supplant the self-concept. We have a shattering of the self-concept. That's a shattering of the way that I make meaning to the world, the ways in which I build relationships, and those kinds of things. And what we are, again, postulating what would happen about if we took something like racial socialization that really is about teaching positive values about yourself and race. Sometimes it comes from the home, sometimes it comes from the reference group that you feel yourself to be a part of. Sometimes it comes from, the wider community. But that racial socialization is an important piece to teach those positive values, those positive ways in which I feel that I exist, and ways in which I understand my continuity, understand that I have a past, I have a present, and I do have a future. And a future that is not just dictated to me by my oppressor, but I'm able to understand that I have a future free from the oppressive sway. And so what racial socialization is usually an organized process. We have done rites of passage, there's rites of passages, and there are other activities that look at really being able to instill those positive values. Also, there's the salutogenic kind of values that exist in that context as well. Remember, I talked about, sort of the talk that Black parents give their sons and daughters, really talking about how you interact with authority figures, state authority figures, and being able to cope these work through these situations to bring the best outcome. So, and again, I talked about earlier the Norris and Marcus kind of concept that there are two systems of schema, there's schemata, and this sort of fracturing nature breaks off the sort of personal identity away from the racial identity. And what we've seen is that when we combine those two, when we work towards healing the racial identity, we work towards giving the psychoeducation about who you are, understanding that there's a past and that there's a future, that what we see is improvement in many of the deleterious outcomes that that African-American youth experience, not just youth, but adults as well. We see the process of bringing back those things into concert, to work together, coordination together, really trying to supplant those kinds of ways in which the oppressor has removed our self-concept and replaced it with a self-concept that is dictated and really looks at the ways in which we are able to function without the supplanted self-concept. So what we know, that it addresses the belief, values, self-concept, racial identity development, and those kinds of issues. Understanding that this is not a new idea. Really, it came about in the 70s. It really came about in the 70s when people like Bill Cross and Bailey Jackson and others were looking at this sort of negrescence process, that process of becoming more African-centered rather than Euro-centric kind of view. So it really was something that we have been looking at for a number of years, recognizing that what we're doing is what we see are improvements in things such as academic performance. We see improvements in a number of different ways, the academic performance and self-concept development. We see even in treatment for drug abuse and treatment for other addictive behaviors, we see improvement when that racial socialization is a piece of it. And so we hope that we will see that same kind of bump in efficacy in a trauma-focused CBT.
Okay, thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Questions, concerns, comments?
Moses, I think you have a CBT question.
Yes, I think I'd asked it I wanted to ask it previously when I had seen that CBT is not very functional in the African American community, but you did follow up and explain some of the reasons why. So with that being said, because they're coming from a different perspective, maybe there is more of the not being responsive to the questionnaire because of how it's asked. My question is, are we doing anything on the providers who are, maybe using CBT as a mode of treatment so that they can be able to understand the African-American community, so that when they are using that tactic as treatment modality, they can accommodate the African-Americans and get the positive response that they expect?
Right. There's a movement in counselor training and training of mental health professionals to recognize any implicit bias that they come with, recognizing we all come with some kinds of implicit bias, and to also understand that culture is more than just the way that we celebrate holidays, but also culture gives us that matrix on which identity is built, identity and self-concept is built. And so recognizing that and recognizing that when they come without that knowledge. So oftentimes if they come from a more European American kind of perspective, they don't have that knowledge. So there are all sorts of ways and training programs for practicing professionals, for teachers, and those people who are interested in broadening their perspective and being able to provide interventions cross-culturally. That's what we see happening.
You have for you, Khalisa?
I'm sorry?
So we didn't hear that comment? We may not even.
Oh.
So any other questions about racial socialization? It sounds to me like a very educative process. a mentoring process, one that's set within group and familial contexts.
I have one comment maybe, and this is very personal. I'm married to here locally to a Jordanian Palestinian, and I have 2 kids that have Palestinian and Jordanian origin, obviously. So with everything that is going on at the moment, they're 8 and 12 years old. And with everything that is going on, obviously a lot is talked about in school, and especially the older one comes with many questions about identity and belonging. And this is often very heavy-hearted for me because I only have one identity, right? I grew up in Germany to German parents, and so it's really difficult for me sometimes to create this kind of socialization, and together with my husband as well, who has 2 identities plus another one because he grew up in Canada. So, you know, there's a lot of we have a lot of things going on in the family, and we're trying to make sense of it for our boys. And yeah, that's it. I'm basically just asking for some kind of support, what parents like me could do.
May I respond, Ian and Gerald?
Sure.
I can assure you that you are not the only one. I am a Palestinian refugee, and I'm married to a Jerusalemite woman. And when we had our first son, when he grew up, he was 6 years old. He asked us this question: if my friends asked me, where am I from? Should I tell them I am from Bisan, which is the Israelis call Bet Shan, my country where I was deported from? Or should I tell them I am from Nablus, where your family dad lives in? Or should I tell them I am from Jerusalem, where my mother's dad lives in? So I said to him, Osama, tell anyone ask you, where are you from? I am from this home. So mixed identities is really a challenge. So it might be also an opportunity to make competition how to help and be a source of aid to all other identities. The Jordanian, to the Palestinian, to the American, to the Canadian. So we are all human beings. This is my identity. I am a human being. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me also say, let me share with you a point of personal growth for myself. In that, well, you know, I spent a lot of time here in Amherst, Massachusetts, and Amherst, Massachusetts is very provincial and considered to be, well, we sent out this sort of liberal kind of propaganda that may not actually exist. And at one point there was always, it just looked, I would always bump into these kids who were transracially adopted. They had Caucasian parents and they were African-American. And I see the little girls, their hair wasn't done right. You know, their hair was just a mess, but they had on very expensive clothes, but their hair was a mess, and all of those kind of good things like that, that was part of shaping who they were. And I said, you know, I don't know if that's such a great thing, the sort of the transracial adoption. Then I bumped into a couple who had adopted an African-American child. And that child knew more African-American history at that point than I thought I did. That child, the parents had taken a concerted effort. I mean, it wasn't like we go to a synagogue and then you just the other little African-American child at the synagogue. They had done it was deliberate in educating that child and making sure that child had an identity that was separate from them, and understanding that it's okay for that child to have an identity that is separate from them. That was one of the best, the child was very well adjusted, you know, felt very much a sense of who they were, and very much that association benefited them. And so that made me start thinking about, is it the race of the parent, or is it what that parent does, and helping that child to build that identity, and helping that child be able to have good feelings about themselves, and understand that what you're dealing with when you're dealing with bias, that's someone else's baggage. That's not yours. That's not yours. And so that's a point of personal growth for me, and that I was able to see it's not so much about the grace of the parent. And it's when you try to meld that child that is phenotypically different, maybe phenotypically different than you, into just, oh, you're just like everybody else here. Everybody, you know, has, you know, everybody else, you're just like everybody else, but saying that, recognizing the difference and helping that child relate through that lens of difference. I hope that was helpful.
John.
Does anyone else want to comment on that issue of challenging parenting?
Oh, we have one in the room.
Oh, sorry, Hilda.
As you
I can ask you to speak loudly so we can pick it up if it's possible.
this whole session, and being a counselor in training, it's just realizing that most of it I will not be able, like when it comes to being particularly sensitive and being able to try and reduce the cultural bias, and realize it will take more of my initiative as compared to waiting for it to be taught in the system. Because most of it, I think, when I began, I kind of felt like, okay, I need more courses on this, but I realized to be able to be not, I believe not, someone can never be that ready, but it takes an initiative from my side to be able to if it's more reading or more engagement, to be able to be more culturally sensitive, and I believe with a 3-year program that we will be hopefully.
I'm not sure if you heard that. You may have done. Hilda's talking about her becoming a school counsellor, and that she's discovered that she can't necessarily rely on the education system to provide that depth of nuance and sophistication of cultural understandings. So she's really referring to herself having to do her own homework, her own study in order to be able to communicate and understand with children from other cultures and settings. Was that in the ballpark of what you were saying? Okay, thanks, Hilda. Dr. Ziad, I believe you have your hand up. Is that Dr. Yeah, thank you.
Good evening in our time, and maybe good morning or so for you in the USA. Thank you very much for the invitation, actually, but just maybe to share, as you've asked Dr. Ian, and maybe to answer Christine, sorry, not a question, but I mean just to share. Maybe Dr. Ghassan has reflected what we feel in Palestine, but for me, I would like to say to Christine that you might feel internal feeling about your husband's, let's say, multi or double nationality and growing up in Canada. For us in Palestine, we feel as external feeling. To clarify that or to explain that is the following. I mean, for you, you might sometimes think, what your kids should tell if anybody asks them, what do you belong to? But for us, I am Palestinian living in Jerusalem. And by passport, I don't have the Palestinian passport. I have to have laissez-passer, which is travel document, if I want to travel from Ben Gurion Tel Aviv airport. Also, we have what they call the temporary Jordanian passport actually for us. So I have 3-in-1, which is Palestinian in nature as nationality, Jordanian passport for some countries, Israeli travel document or passport for others. So sometimes when I travel, I go to some of the countries. So they know, if you provide them with the laissez-passer, they know it's written in it that nationality is Jordanian. So our Israeli cousins even don't like to write Palestinian still on the document that they give us, which is temporary, not like the Israeli passport. I mean, for the nationals, like our Arab Palestinians who live inside Israel. And we are not allowed to have the Palestinian passport. So sometimes we feel to be strangers, not in the geographical meaning. I mean, sometimes you feel, sorry, if you travel to a place which you don't belong to, you feel stranger. But I feel I am living in my own country and feeling stranger in the psychological meaning, in the philosophical meaning, because you really don't find yourself where to belong to. Of course, internally, we have the determination to belong to our nation and to our people and to our life and actualization. But unfortunately, outside, if you are in some countries, actually don't accept actually for you to write you are Palestinian. So either you produce the Jordanian passport and say, I am Jordanian, with full respect for our Jordanian brothers, but I'm not Jordanian. Even Jordanians don't want me to be Jordanian because what they give me is a document of what they call it temporary. Sometimes, it's not easy. And even the visa is for Jordanians who have the permanent Jordanian passport with what we call national number in Jordan itself. So, Christine, what I would like to say, or what I'm trying to say, is that sometimes it's internal feeling, whether what do you think, how do you deal with that, or reflect your personality, and sometimes it's external, as in our case. I hope this was clear for you, just to share with you our feeling, our sort of being strangers in our own country. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr.
Thanks,
Ziad.
Professor Ziad.
Thank you. I've worked with, as I said, with kids and young adults in the West Bank, and we did extensive travel. So, and I was responsible to get musicians with Palestinian origin from outside of the West Bank into the West Bank. And so everything that you just described was my daily life. And sadly, small children at the age of 8, they knew exactly what you just described. They knew the different nuances of being Palestinian, what that meant externally, as you said so nicely. And it broke my heart every time, because that's not how you should grow up. You should not wonder about what document you need to move from one place to the other. And I remember one of my students, I think he was 12 at that time. He was a cellist, very gifted cellist, and he forgot his kushan, the birth certificate. And he, the rule is that you had to be 16 to have the kushan with you, but rules are made up by the minute. So he panicked in the bus, and I had to kind of talk my way out of the whole thing, because the IDF soldiers made problems at the checkpoints, and he was 12. My eldest son is 12, and that's not how a child should be living his life or her life. So yeah, I understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
So I'm just aware of the time. So what I'm going to do now, before handing over to Gerald and Rassan, just make some practice recommendations that came from our study comparing African American and Palestinian in intentional trauma and ways of addressing child adolescent traumatization. So we spoke about the congruity of language between therapist or paraprofessional and the African American or Palestinian youth. You're talking the same language, cultural language, that is. Again, similarly, is there a match of African-American Palestinian youth values and beliefs that are embedded within the treatment to fit with racial norms? Are therapists and paraprofessionals trained in cultural sensitivity on how to create cultural safety within the therapy experience to reduce that cultural bias that can get in the way? And is there communicated an appreciation within the kind of healing, the space of healing for African-American Palestinian youth who recognizing their experiences of colonialization, structural racism, and its relationship to their trauma? And finally, interventions as a participative process involving African Americans and Palestinian youth voice in relation to the prejudices, the stigmatized identities, and the discrimination on their beliefs and behaviors. So we're setting perhaps more procedural, protocol-focused, trauma-focused CBT approaches set within a much wider socio-political and cultural and historical context that seems to be the missing, some of the missing links, and racial socialization as a process that can facilitate and enable some of these developments to occur. Our other recommendations from our paper highlight potential future research to explore what does cultural safety mean for African American and Palestinian youth experiencing racial socialization, trauma-focused CBT. Now, how do they feel safe within that therapeutic experience, embodied safety? To the need to conceptualize group-based racial socialization and trauma-focused CBT, including the delivery of insider paraprofessionals. So the marriage of racial socializations, trauma-focused CBT, but also the delivery by paraprofessionals. Identify youth, caregiver, and paraprofessional perceptions on the feasibility, acceptability, engagement, retention, and dropout from group-based racial socialization, trauma-focused CBT. So the need to research some of those statistics on engagement, retention, and dropout, and conduct quasi-experimental and research designs on the efficacy of racial socialization along with trauma-focused CBT. And study outcomes that go beyond, the PTSD, as you'll have heard today. There's a need to go well beyond PTSD to look at racial trauma, intergenerational trauma, complex PTSD, and developmental trauma. What would those outcomes look like that would be assessed? Now, it's a much more narrow view that's currently evaluated, and tease out the most effective components. And just, again, not accepting racial socialization and trauma-focused CBT. If there's a marriage of those two approaches, then what are the most effective parts of racial socialization? What are the most effective parts of trauma-focused CBT that go together? How are these best integrated? And that still it's unknown. So we need to conduct some studies to explore what are the best component parts that fit. So those are the kind of sum up of our recommendations for practice and research. But I'll pass you back to Gerald and then Rassam for final words, if that's okay. Gerald, are you going to finish off the experience for us that you started at the beginning of this session?
And in the interest of time, we'll skip that part. What I want to do though is to get some feedback from you. Actually, we have 5 minutes. If we could just we sort of presented everything in sort of compartmentalized nature, but we recognize that, well, part of this research initiative that we began and really looking at sort of expanding began as a conversation. It began as a conversation. And from that conversation, we were able to identify, especially with Rassam and myself, we were able to say, a lot of what you're talking about sounds just like the stuff that I'm talking about, the things that I went through. And so that's where sort of the foundations of our research began. So if we could just take a couple minutes, and if there are questions that come from throughout our presentation today, from not, you don't have to just limit it to a particular section or particular compartment, or some feedback you would like to give, we would appreciate that. Questions, concerns, comments?
I'll just here on this.
Okay.
I'm sorry?
You can do something on this one?
This one's scratch.
Scratch here.
If I could just make a comment about potential future work, or just something to maybe consider mentioning in the first or mid part of the presentation, talking about the scale of the problem. There were different statistics about how there were, I think, 11 million African-American slaves, and then that number was expanded to include how many African-Americans there are today. So all throughout Latin America, slaves were brought by Europeans. African slaves were brought by Europeans. So there's this very similar issues that African Peruvians, African Mexicans, African Brazilians, all throughout the continent are experiencing. So I think if you include those numbers, it would strengthen your argument for why this is important. The issues aren't identical, but they're very similar. And throughout the Caribbean region, Barbados was mentioned, for example, but mentioning all of those areas. I was born in Bermuda, and the majority of the population is descendant of slaves that were brought. But it was only when I was about 8 years old, for the first time ever, that Black people had a majority in the government and were able to make decisions that, you know, affected them in ways that were beneficial as compared to being under really powerful white British rule from the time that, you know, ever since the British colony was created. And there's a lot of intergenerational trauma and intentional trauma in the way that the country is designed, in the way the police force works, in the way that prison system works. It's very similar to the US, and I'm sure a lot of places have similar issues. So just thinking about like all of those other places as well, and maybe collaborations you could do with other countries within the Americas that have African-American populations.
Sure. Yeah.
Smith.
When you finish, send me message, yeah?
May I say some words, Ian and Gerald?
Yes, yes.
Before we end up. Well, I don't usually say goodbye to anyone. I can assure you that the door is open for any future cooperative, productive initiative. So please contact Professor Ian Baron for any initiative, and you will find us available.
Thank you, Rassam. I think it's an important point to make. Again, moving this on from an event to a process. There's plenty of work to be
meet very soon to present other achievements to them and to others.
Any other questions, concerns, comments that you'd like to voice? Well, if not, I'm gonna take a little bit of liberty here and speak for some of the bosses in the room, but on behalf of the trauma-informed global resilience, that R word is problematic. So let me say resilience, and also the Center for Youth Engagement at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I want to thank you all for coming and participating, being a great group, being a part of what will inform us as we move forward, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Look for additional advertisements about our group and where we are going.
Thank you, brothers.
And pleasure to be with you all. Sorry, Rassam.
Thank you all, brothers, and mainly my Palestinian brothers who attended this event. and keep in touch all.
Okay. So thank you for that, and look forward to seeing you. Forward to seeing you all again.
Thank you very much.
Inshallah soon.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks, Sayed. Hey, Majid.
Any feedback in the room?
Just that I really appreciate all the work. I mean,